All right, my friends. Last time we spoke, we got into about halfway through the Magic Mountain. And as you recall, thinking always about time and the uses of time. The fact that 7 years pass in this 700-page text, whereas 1 day passes in the 700, 800-page text of Ulysses, and then only around 200 pages. And this is Dalloway. One wonders what the relationship between space and time is. In particular, looking at the Magic Mountain, the first 4 chapters that take only 3 weeks are about a third, maybe 2/7 of the entirety of the text itself. And so the final 3 chapters, even though they are only 3/7 of the text in terms of chapter numbers, are take up something like 5/7 of the entire text. I encourage you to really reflect on the fact that some things take longer than expected when doing your writing. Maybe the case that you look at writing as, say, a unitary event. You sit and you write. We talked about this a little bit last time. But I think as you become more sophisticated and are capable of seeing the many parts that make up the cart, as Socrates would say, he said, do you really know the essence of something, of a cart? If you think it has 4 parts, but an expert knows that it has 100, you right now have the 4-part knowledge of writing. But once you get into it, I think you realize that there are a lot more parts to it. Oh, I have to think of the title. Oh, I have to do my bibliography. It's called Works Cited in MLA. Oh, I need to figure out how to do that. Oh, I did it on a generator, but the generator got it wrong. So now I have to revise that. And that was 1 citation. Oh, that took a whole lot of time. So, well, welcome to life, my friends. But life is a complicated and sophisticated thing, and not always. You will blame the representations, the mostly fictional, that you received as a young person for your simple ideas about how things work. Often case, if you watch Disney movies or young adult or read young adult literature, the character is made into a hero that is moved by fate towards heroism. In life as it truly is, represented to mature intellects rather than young adult intellects, we expose you to the complexity of things, which is often unpleasant because it doesn't just suggest that you are the hero of life that is guaranteed to be successful no matter what, and everybody believes it. This is, like I said, the prejudice of the young and also of tourists to believe that everybody thinks the best of one and what's the best for one. Though there are people in your life who do want the best for you, often those who help you to improve your skills and who you dislike, ironically enough. That said, we have to talk a little bit more about time today and how Hans Castorp spends his time as we finish our time on the Magic Mountain. So we read some quotes last time on what boredom is, habits, and the phenomenology of settling in. I do have a note here that Hans finally meets a Mexican woman who doesn't have command of the local languages, French, Spanish, or French, German, or Russian. She's a Spanish speaker, and so she only knows a very small amount of French, and so she's called Toulidou, because that's what she says all the time. Literally, that means all of them in French, but it usually means both of them. And it might be a suggestion that both of her children are going to die or have died. Her son is alive. One of her sons is alive for some amount of time during chapter 5. And it's described as a very handsome young man, yet looks, riches. What is it that saves one from death in this text? Can you be rich? Can you be brilliant? Can you be beautiful? Can you be a man? Can you be a woman? Can you be high class? Can you be low class? Who is spared from the tuberculosis in the sanatorium? It would seem nobody. And so people have to figure out how to deal with the sort of relativity of the things that are most important in their social lives. Who am I married to? What is my profession? Who is my social sort of cast around me, or cast of characters around me? These questions are relativized and make one question in this very high spot where one can have a perspective on that which falls below, sometimes perhaps correlate to what we call the 1,000-foot perspective, where one can see everything as it lays. One realizes that the burp hop and the time one has there gives one not only a chance to physically recuperate from illness, but to really reflect on the nature of one's own existence and what is truly important in one's life. And perhaps you have realized that reflecting on time, death, and illness helps you to do this, particularly when one is very ill. It's easy to see the good parts of life as good and not to be world weary of. Very sick, head cold, snotting, coughing, perhaps a little bit of stomach flu going on. All of a sudden you remember, man, eating food at my own desire, at my own pleasure, and food that I want is really wonderful. Food that will stay down and I'll digest it, and I don't have to worry about how much of it I eat or whether I eat something with fiber or not. And all this time, I'm snotting into a Kleenex, this infinite amount of mucus every minute or so, and all the people around me who I generally want to, regard me as a sort of superior or awesome person are all kind of looking at me like they're disgusted and annoyed because I'm just, I don't want to snort because I'll actually snort mucus into my hand, and that would go beyond the bounds of representation and become reality. Very sort of anti-quixotic moment there. But while one is ill and has time away from the normal flow of life, particularly if one is placed in a physical location where reflection is enhanced, whether it be a school or the Berg Hall, it gives people a chance to really take a good look at themselves. Not only are they being physically examined by Dr. Behrens, mentally examined by Dr. Krakowski, they may themselves take a little time to reflect on their lives. And I think you sadly see what the nature of most people's reflection is at the Berg Hall. What is it that most of them spend their time doing? Do they become great scientists or doctors or philosophers? Stephen Brini is working on a piece for an encyclopedia called The Sociology of Suffering. And his impetus, his motivation, like those humanists around him, seems to be to remove suffering from the world. So he's trying to make good use of his time. And Hans, though he's a bit of a dilettante and jumps around, I said charlatan last time. Dilettante is another good French word to express somebody who only gets into the surface of things and never gets deep into them. Most of the characters that we see represented give into what Hans Castorp thinks of as egoism, or Stephen Brini says base sensualism. And we thought about this last time. In a world where religious or philosophical systems no longer govern large social bodies of individuals, for example, one won't be persecuted by the Catholic Church in the early 20th century with legal force. Though the Catholic Church still had quite a bit of power in certain places, particularly Ireland, as we know from the fall of their great leader in Uglin's imagination. We see that most of these individuals, when given time and space to reflect, instead of reflect, they really, and perhaps this is apropos for your own lives right now, they really indulge in recreation. Recreation is a really interesting word, because if you were an English learner, you would probably think it meant something like creating something anew, like rejuvenation, for example, or renovation. But recreation means something totally different in English. It means to have fun, to indulge in something while one is not working. Recreational activities. In fact, we have, what is it that we have? One of our most amazing buildings on campus is called the UREC, the University Recreation Center. It's a place where people go to, well, work out in the gym, but mostly use their leisure time to have fun, to be with each other in a way that helps people to relax and blow off some steam, to become a little less stressed, and to give perhaps one perspective on things in life. Sometimes you may have noticed that, like, having a really stressful day, got a bunch of work to do, you go run 4 or 5 miles, and all of a sudden you're like, I think I can do this. I'm capable of doing tough stuff, and I've really done something tough today, and that was so tough that, maybe this essay will not actually kill me. Running a bunch of miles in the humid Baton Rouge sun with these terrible drivers that apparently one shot at and hit a biker a week and a half ago. I, of course, am a biker, so I take this very seriously, though I know the risks. Recreation is meant, at least if you take Aristotle's perspective on it, to get you back to work. And this is a question you might ask yourself. Do you work to recreate? Do you work for your leisure habits? Like so many people's bumper stickers. Rather be fishing, as it were. It's like that's kind of a bummer, because you're probably spending most of your life not fishing. So it's kind of I would wish to be doing what I want to do the vast majority of the time, not only occasionally. That doesn't work for me. But like Aristotle, do you believe that you play so that you can work, or that you work so that you can play? I think you'll find that most people, particularly your age, have it inverted from Aristotle. Aristotle says, well, you have to play and relax every now and then because you only have so much energy. We call this libido now. Usually means sexual energy, but originally meant just mental energy. And if you've ever taken a psychology course, you've probably heard about the concept of will, and that you only have so much. That say if you've had a very stressful day where you've worked very hard, at the end of the day, if you're on a diet and chocolate is put in front of you and you are a lover of it, you're gonna have a lot less willpower to resist such things at the time. And so Aristotle says, well, since life comes in waves, and you have a time of work, and then you have some time when you really can't work, you should use that time when you're not working in order to make it so that you can work as well as possible. Again, and so his notion and theory of recreation is that you do that which brings your stress and your fatigue levels down low enough to where you can work productively. I would suggest that the philosophy at the Berghof, and probably the modern philosophy, certainly the modern philosophy at a large state university, is that one works in order to play. In fact, work is sort of we have sort of these pseudo-Marxist notions where we're like, why do we work? And then we mix them with sort of proto-Judeo-Christian notions of work being associated with the fall from Eden. And we think, there's the man, some sort of man, who makes me work. If I lived in some other time or place, I wouldn't have to work and I could just indulge in whatever I want to. Caution you about that fantasy and where it leads. Because you see characters in this text living that fantasy. What do they have to do with their days? Like you, they don't have to work that much. A lot of their time is spent as patients, being passive. What do you spend a lot of your day doing? Sitting in lecture halls, receiving information, perhaps thinking, usually probably imagining whatever you kind of feel like imagining in order to get through the time. But then they have these rest cures, and they have all these meals. And they go down to the city and enjoy themselves. But it all seems very pleasant. And I think while I read this text, I find it all very pleasant. But I think underlying this way of life is a theory of the novel, which can be a little bit frightening, which is this. And it's the same theory that underlines Don Quixote, that reading modern fiction or watching modern fiction may have a deleterious effect on you. It may not lead you to understanding the world. It may lead you to imposing fantasies onto the world that are inaccurate. That in fact, reading a novel like Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain or Don Quixote might be as much of a waste of time as how the characters in the Berghof waste their time ready to die. And underlying that is there a philosophy in the air as a result of modernism, now postmodernism and post-postmodernism, that we are all just sort of sick, empty individuals existing on this mortal plane for a very finite amount of time with no divine being waiting for us and no path to get us there? Is there any difference in how we spend our time? Is there any difference in living justly, morally, well, helping others, as opposed to just living as an egoist or essentialist? An egoist is somebody that just focuses on themselves. Ego is the Latin word for I, it's a pronoun. So when you say someone has a lot of ego, ego also is one of the three parts of the mind that Sigmund Freud puts forth. Ego, superego, and below all of them, the id. The id is another pronoun. It means it. The id is your base instincts. The ego is your conscious personality. The superego is the sort of moral father that you develop based on the rules that you have been subjected to during the course of your life. You think, oh, I shouldn't do that. That's the superego, according to Freud. But so is the Berghof and how time is used there, and the very differing languages and philosophies and ways of living there, supposed to be a representation of the early 20th century. The people have lost their path, and in being lost, they don't go on great journeys and find anything, but more like what we actually know physically happens to people when they get lost in the woods. They end up running in circles and getting nowhere. Interestingly enough, Dante's Inferno, his hell, is 9 concentric circles. And so one wonders, is the Berghof and the representation of modernism supposed to represent a heaven on the top of this mountain where the air is thin and where one is no longer subject to the bounds of normal time or work or even expectation? Nobody is expected to do anything in the Berghof. Many young people often find the burden of expectation all too much. Oh, we thought you had such potential. You say, oh, too much to bear. Why does everybody think so much of me? Which is itself, I think, a wonderful tragedy to experience, to have people think so highly of one. But is the Berghof more of a heaven, or is it supposed to be a representation more of hell? One thing I'll say about Dante's hell is that the characters experience no growth, no change, no development. And part of Dante's Aristotelian understanding of the nature of being a human is that transformation is important to being a human. That humans do not want things to always be the same, that they want a certain trajectory to their lives. And those in the hell, they never develop physically or psychologically. Their thought never moves past where they lived and where it got to while they were living. And in fact, they end up repeating the same old platitudes, the same old cliches. Perhaps you know somebody who tells you the same stories over and over, or the same platitudes. Is such a person themselves still progressing and becoming more, or are they subject to what Dante described in his Inferno? Are they retreading the same steps they've already treaded 1,000 times before? Is that the sort of life that you would want to live yourself? Or would you want to make it somewhere with your steps? That is, that's one of the great questions. And so as we finish working through the Magic Mountain, I encourage you to think of the largest questions of the course and also the text itself. What is the best way to use your time if you find yourself in a moment of reflection where you can look in some absolute sense, to some extent, at your own life, what you've accomplished, what you can accomplish, what you want to accomplish, or just what you want to do with your time. Perhaps reflecting on it will give you a better idea so that you can generate a plan that is more likely to be successful than if you just take things as they are, like Hans Castorp. He doesn't seem to be the model for how one should live one's life. His life goes off track after a 3-week vacation. He ends up spending 7 years, an ungodly amount of time to lose as somebody in their 20s, their early 20s, to all of a sudden be 30 and to have lost those years of developing one's career, one's friendships, one's family, would be, well, would you, like Odysseus, would you, like Hans Castorp, want to lose 7 years of your life? And just because I'm begging the question a little bit, would you agree that Hans, in fact, loses 7 years of his life at the Berghof? Or you might think I'm totally off base. But in fact, he does transform, and it's a very good use of time, and there's nothing hellish at all about the Berghof. It's in fact very heavenly. And I think you can maintain that perspective. Though I would have some back and forth with you if you really wanted to get into it during some sort of seminar. That said, so we meet Tullidou. We see that there is a certain schedule, a rotating schedule to the Berghof. Every couple of weeks, Dr. Krakowski gives a lecture on psychoanalysis on Sundays. And it's very like psychoanalysis that he finds the root cause of almost all illness in dysfunctions of love. He makes the claim that there is a connection, a psychosomatic connection. Psycho means soul, Somatos means, or soma means body in Greek. There is a soul-body or a mind-body connection between one's thoughts and one's body. This has been proven, by the way. There's a concept in conventional psychology now, not just psychoanalysis, of affect, which is that one feels an emotion so vividly that it actually affects one's body constitution. You probably all know the experience of blushing, for example. That is a moment of affect, of extraordinary emotion. You're starting to sweat because something's going wrong, or going pale for a moment. You're drawing your breath in. These are moments of affect where your physical constitution is in fact affected by the emotion that you feel, often mitigated by something you have realized. Oh, this project's due now. I haven't started. I'm still enrolled in that class. I didn't withdraw. Those are moments that affect. In any case, Hans then, in chapter 4, finally makes an appointment with Dr. Behrens, though he is not sick, as it were. Do remember that Dr. Krukowski, when Hans Castorp first met him, Hans says, "Oh no, I'm not going to be a patient here. I'm perfectly healthy." Dr. Krukowski sort of arches an eyebrow at this and says, "Perfectly healthy. I wonder about that." Well, after Hans Castorp has his meeting, has his appointment with Dr. Behrens, Behrens looks around at him, has his otoscope on, and is listening to the lungs in the back. Perhaps you've had this happen before. Breathe in deeply, cough, okay. And there's apparently some sort of muffled spots on his lung. Later, an X-ray will be taken that has also spots. Though when talking with Settembrini, apparently the imaging technology of X-rays, and it's still the case now if you look at X-rays, they're not extremely clear, and MRIs are often actually quite better. Magnetic resonance images. Yeah, if you study psychology or biology, you learn all about these various imaging technologies. But Settembrini, the great rationalist, whom you would think would believe in medicine quite a bit, though this strange medicine that mixes psychology and biology is perhaps a new sort of medicine and is open to question, particularly sexuality or love as a root cause of so much illness. Settembrini suggests, there have been people up here before who were very happy to be called sick. And these people wanted to stay here. And you should really know that these images, sometimes they're more like Rorschach tests. Perhaps you've heard of a Rorschach test before or read The Watchmen. Rorschach. These are those tests where you're given a sheet of paper and it's got a bunch of ink blotches on them. And what do you see? Like, I see my father hitting a dog. And you're like, okay, that's all Pangea, whatever. The original content. I see a bunch of ink. If somebody is particularly realist and unsymbolic in their thinking. But it might be the case that Behrens doesn't really see what he thinks he sees. And that Hans himself, not really wanting to get on with his life, is perfectly happy to just take the diagnosis as it is. I mean, Behrens is a doctor. What is he looking for? Is he looking for signs of sickness or signs of health in people? And I'll tell you, people's professions start to govern how they see things. I know many police officers, for example. Many police officers deal with people that you never, ever have to deal with. The sorts of people that start to affect your way of looking at things. I'm not saying necessarily hardened criminals. There are probably fewer hardened criminals than you think of, given TV cop dramas and legal dramas, as it were, but they deal with people who are having really bad lives and tend to do the things that they get caught doing over and over again, particularly certain like homeless grifters that they'll pick up over and over again. People, when they become the sort of usual society of a certain profession, the profession starts to look at the world as if it is an extension of their surroundings. So doctors start to look for sickness. Psychologists start to look for mental illness. Teachers look for and often find ignorance in those around them. And so Dr. Behrens in this case, as a physician, is looking for signs of illness. He may find signs of illness. But whether Hans is really as ill as might be suggested is open to question. And I do not in any way wish to disparage the medical art nor the psychological art, particularly how gifted our physicians are today, and especially our surgeons as well. Sorts of surgeries that we have these days that can be successful, far more successful than 100 years ago when this was written. That said, there is a subjective element to the medical craft. There is an interpretive element to it. One that if one were sort of sick and had some evidence of illness, or at least a past illness, one might be able to get away with being interpreted as being seriously sick, at least for some amount of time. But could that perhaps lead to a moral illness? If you really tell your parents that you're sick and they let you stay home from school, though you're healthy, will that help you in the long run? Do you just all of a sudden go back to school and you feel good, or have you realized that a little fib can actually get you something that you want? Has that affected your moral fabric? Or is what one wonders. And so, with Hans Castorp, he literally says, so you're writing on the Magic Mountain, keep this in mind. Say the opposite of this. Red warning signs should go off in your head as well as sirens. When Hans Castorp was first saddled with his time by barons, barons gives months to people. You'll be here 4 to 6 months. You'll be here a year. And gives the initial months to Hans Castorp. Hans Castorp starts to refer to his time at the Berghof as his freedom. Now that he is sequestered to the Berghof, he says that he's free. And so one wants to think about differing versions of what it means to be free. There is the libertine notion, that one can give in to any vice. You've probably thought about this. If you had infinite money and the law didn't really affect you, what would you do with your time? Would you, start a not-for-profit and be a CEO and drive, or bike to work and try and save the world? Maybe. Or would you say give in to sensualism? Would you buy all the nicest food, buy a nice car, buy a nice house, go on wonderful trips? What about when all of that got boring? What would you start to use your money for? The idea of being a libertine is that one is free to do what one wishes, but the results of doing what one does have a negative effect. I would say an alcoholic is a good example of a libertine. They have indulged in quite a bit of freedom, even at the expense of their own physical organism. That is how free such a person is. But in engaging in such freedom, they lose certain freedoms. They lose the autonomy over their body. They might lose their job. They might lose their family. They might lose their freedom, even if they have to steal in order to acquire money, in order to drink, or if they get into violent altercations, which is something that can happen when people drink, and especially when they drink a lot. Numbers game. Is that freedom? And is that the sort of freedom that you see on display with these sensualists and egoists at the Berghof? There's another notion of being free, of liberality. And I mean liberality not in the sense of prodigality. The political idea behind liberal, besides meaning free, coming from the Latin word for free, means to be freer with one's money. The prodigal son, you may have heard of this story from the Gospels, is not a story of a man who goes on the journey. He does. But to be prodigal means to waste all one's money, to lose all one's money. And so there's a political sense of liberality, which is to be liberal with what one has, to be freely giving with it, as it were. But an alternate notion to being a libertine is the Spinozist idea of being free. That if one develops discipline and skill, the sort of discipline and skill that enables one to act in the world in a way that allows one's intentions to be met with success, that is true freedom. Sometimes you hear this with people who really like, say, the military or Navy SEALs, they're like, discipline equals freedom. And these are opposing notions of freedom. Is being free just having the time and the wherewithal to do what you want when you want? Or is being free having the capacity to achieve what you want when you want to do it? Is the libertine truly free, or is the traditional liberal individual truly free? Maybe more libertarian, I guess, in that sense of the word. Libertarians, you may know, are a small political party that really love freedom. And so they and the Democrats share the liberal name. They are both liberals, as it were. Though, of course, the Democrats are one of our large two parties, the donkeys as opposed to the elephants, the blue as opposed to the red. If you watch presidential debates now, you'll see these sorts of things. The different tie colors will tell you which side individuals are on, if you didn't know that sort of thing already. In any case, I diverged from Dr. Krokowski meeting Hans Castorp early in the book, and Hans Castorp saying that he was perfectly healthy, and Dr. Krokowski arching an eyebrow and saying perfectly healthy. After Hans Castorp has his meeting with Dr. Behrens, his appointment, he sees Dr. Krokowski. Dr. Krokowski comes up to him with yellow teeth and 3 heads shorter than Dr. Behrens, who is, as you know, very large, with large hands, large feet that Sutton Breed makes fun of, bulging eyes, and a distended neck. So he really looks pretty intense at people, and his eyes are bloodshot. So perhaps someday I will be able to really do an impression of him. I hope not too well, but time has an effect on all of us. Dr. Krokowski comes up to Hans and says, I hope you understand that when I said that I doubted whether you were perfectly healthy, or I seemed surprised at you using that notion, that it's only because I've never met somebody who was perfectly healthy. Not that I thought you had tuberculosis or actually ill, and I wouldn't will that on you just to have been correct in my assumption. But I think something that you see here is that Dr. Krokowski has just given us a hint to the question we just asked about the nature of illness and the subjective nature of it. He said, nobody I've ever met is perfectly healthy, which means that if you go to a doctor who's looking for an illness, even if you think you're really healthy, is it possible that they'll be able to find something? And is there a second possibility that what they find will be a little bit less malign and a little bit more benign than the doctor expects? Malign, malignant tumors, the ones that are growing, that are cancerous, that kill you. Benign are ones that have stopped growing and will not kill you. So do keep that in mind. If you hear benign, good. Malign, not as good. Probably some surgery at times to cut it out. That's how we deal with cancer. We either try and cut it out, or we try and kill it with radiation. Both are very, very difficult on the world, because cancer comes from you, comes from your own cell systems overdeveloping malignant cells. And so it is truly the crab that comes from beneath the waves and pinches you on the foot. You do know that cancer is the astrological sign for a crab. And that's the notion underlying it. It comes out of nowhere. It's invisible to you until it hits you. And insofar as it comes from within, that's absolutely correct. But in Krokowski suggesting he's never met somebody fully healthy, who does that suggest could find their way into the tuberculosis standpoint? Just tubercular individuals, or potentially anybody? Who is sick in the society and who is healthy? Is that even an accurate question to lay down? One wonders. And so as we move into the second half of the text and move very quickly through it, as time will necessitate here, we have additional, more mature reflections on how time passes. And I hope you're really keeping these in your memory, keeping notes of these, because I've read thousands of books at this time. It is my profession to read and be able to evaluate literature. This is one of the best, if not the best, conception of time that I've seen in any literature. And so take it for what it is. And now we have a new phenomenon about which the narrator would do well to express his own amazement, if only to prevent his readers from being all too amazed on their own. Very clever narrator. The fact is, the account of the first 3 weeks of Hans Castorp's stay with the people up here, 21 days at the height of summer, to which by all calculations of its first week limited, has consumed quantities of space and time that correspond only too well to what the author himself expected, and indeed have confessed. Author and narrator. The coverage of the next 3 weeks of the visit, however, will require about as many lines or words, or even seconds, as the first 3 weeks required pages, fires, these are folders of pages, hours, and working days. We can see it coming. We'll have those 3 weeks behind us and laid to rest in no time. And so there is this quote here is substantiating what we talked about earlier about there being a strange connection between space and time, not an inconsistent connection even. 3 weeks can be represented in 4 chapters that are about 200 pages, but then 3 weeks can be represented in 1 page, 1 sentence, even a word, or perhaps an entire book, as we know from Ulysses, which didn't be 21 days, but 21 minus 20. I would really like you to take that from this course, that there's a strange, permeable, and ever-changing relationship between space and time. In fact, one of the comments made by Sedengrini about the Russians, and the problem with the Russians and their Asiatic thinking compared to the European thinking that he champions, they come from a landmass that's way too big. It's so big that they have trouble conceptualizing time. And he says, all these Russians, they tell you they're going to be there in 5 minutes. There's no difference between 5 minutes and 5 hours for them. That's probably because they live in a landmass that's so large that when they're moving through space and trying to get from one place to another, it takes so dang long, it's hard for them to understand just how much time has passed. I would say that America, the USA, is similar in how large it is, particularly if you ever live out west or you have lived out west. And one city is hours and hours away from another and hundreds of miles. San Diego to Los Angeles, these are giant cities with giant spanses between them. Cities in Phoenix are very, or excuse me, Phoenix is a city in Arizona. Cities, the amount of space out west is enormous, and the amount of time you have to drive in order to get from one place to another, one civilized place to another, as it were, it takes a lot of time. Even Texas is very, very, very like this. The Southeast into the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, far more collected together. You can feel the presence of the initial colonies and the fact that people were packing together on the coast, very similar to what is still the case almost entirely on Australia. But once we expanded outwards and our country became very, very large, in fact, I think we have 4 time zones in total, if you count Hawaii, even more. But the continental US is giant. Does this affect how we look at time? I'll tell you one funny thing. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in the middle of the 19th century, was one of the great poets of the Americans, and was at Harvard as their poet laureate when he was an undergraduate there, and then became a Unitarian minister, all sort of sophisticated things, Harvard, poet, minister. He was writing his poetry and lectures like The American Scholar and Self-Reliance, while there were, this is an expression, cowboys and Indians still around, while the Wild West was still the Wild West. Even prior to parts of Mexico, New Mexico, and California being acquired by the United States. So the landmass is so large that it's like differing parts of it existed in differing times, in different spheres. Think of cowboys fighting against Native Americans or working in collusion with them, building up civilization out west, also destroying certain civilization out west, while there's already a very rooted sort of American place and on the eastern half of the place that we come to be, and is at least so far the United States. One wonders whether coming from a large place as opposed to a small place does affect one's perception of time and what a long time is, what a short time is. Something if you do meet Europeans, particularly Western Europeans, that they will comment on when they come to the United States, even East Coast cities, is that it is so large here. in the United States. Everything is large. The people are big, the streets are humongous, the buildings are big. Something you'll notice if you travel is the bathrooms are huge. The showers are magnificent compared to even in Paris. Paris has tiny little showers. Something you'll notice in the French influence of New Orleans is if you look at some of the older homes and you look at the spiral staircases they have, they're tiny. They're made for little people, which tells you that the humans in this very large place have grown larger over time. So there seems to be some relationship between space and time and even physical organic size. Perhaps you know about koi and koi ponds, that the only limit we know to the size they grow to is the size of the pond in which they exist. Perhaps you in some way are similar, but with how you conceptualize time and space and the world itself rather than, perhaps it is the case that your mind can grow to infinite extension rather than simply your body, which is not something you might necessarily want. In any case, that may well cause amazement. And yet it is perfectly in order and corresponds to the laws of how stories are told and listened to. Because both good order and the laws of narrative require that our experience of time should seem long or short, should expand or shrink in the same way it does for the hero of our story, or young Hans Castorp, who quite unexpectedly has found himself impounded by fate. My goodness. All right. And now as we head through the last couple chapters of the Magic Mountain, perhaps concluding them on this day or on our concluding day on Wednesday, I have to talk about some things that happen in a far quicker span of time, taking less space, perhaps in your minds. One wonders. We are very good at summarizing things in our head. We can even take large spans of time or space and turn them into tiny little pieces of information. Sometimes one spends a lot of time trying to learn a very small thing, and that small thing is all that's left over. Like when panning for gold, for example. So much dust, so little gold. We experienced Walpurgis Nacht, sort of carnival, on the Berghof, or excuse me, on the mountain where the Berghof is. We recall Walpurgis Nacht being very carnival-esque from reading Faust, another German work, and we know that it's very like Mardi Gras. People dispense with normal formalities. They dispense with something that's important to different European languages, less important to our own English language, and these days less important to, I would say, German, Spanish, and Italian. But you may know that in these languages, there's a formal way to address somebody and an informal way. The Z form, the vosotros, or excuse me, the usted form in Spanish, as it were. Está instead of estás. Are you? It shows a certain amount of respect and distance to call somebody by their proper, to conjugate verbs appropriately towards them. It's similar to how we call people Mr. or Doctor. It's a little bit of respect, showing the person's social rank and showing that that's what you're coming to. Calling somebody doctor, usually you're coming to them as a doctor, not just as your friend. If you are a doctor, you don't usually make your friends call you Dr. Fauci, as it were. You wouldn't be much of a friend if you did. In any case, it's time where people's social masks, their persona, or the personae, as the unions would call them, come off. You can sort of give in to their unconscious or underlying passions. One of which happens to be the budding relationship between Madame Chauchat, Madame, not Mademoiselle. She's a wife, she's married, and Hans Castorp. And on this very night, with lots of alcohol flowing, they come into contact. In fact, Hans Castorp finds himself without a pencil. You remember how important the pencil was to his budding homosexual, not love, but desire for Shivslav Hitler, or perhaps fascination is the better way. And this fascination, he is connected with this lady, this slumping lady who slams doors, sits slumped over in seats, and kind of slinks as she walks with her Kyrgyz eyes, which means eyes like Kyrgyzstan. It means eyes with an epicanthic fold, which is explained by Dr. Behrens as being like an extra fold of skin that some Asiatic peoples have. And so she has eyes like someone from Kyrgyzstan is what it means there. So there's some sort of strange meeting between East and West, Asia and Europe happening between these two. There's such different cultures, and they speak in German to each other. Hans Castorp asks her for a pencil. This itself, you could see, is sort of an inversion, because who should be, we're really thinking symbolically and psychoanalytically here, between a man and a woman, who should be giving the pencil, as it were, if we think of some relationship between the organics of men and women and the shape of a pencil, as well as the use of a pencil as a creative instrument. Creative in terms of art, or in terms of even facts, but also in terms of lies too, right? You can write all sorts of fiction with pencils, and art doesn't necessarily have to have much relationship to reality. Where have you seen a Pegasus before? A Minotaur? A Chimera? Probably in art. Maybe in other places. Definitely in art, though. Madame Chauchat and Hans Castorp talk in this broken German, and then they head to her room. This is left subtle, but after she then leaves, Hans Castorp finds out she's going to leave the very next day, and he's been living his whole life to have a chance to finally talk to her, and he finds out that he's only going to talk to her basically the day before she leaves. Tragedy. He does make it to her room. And apparently, oh, we all know this, each sick person in the Burke Hall has had an X-ray taken of their inside and has it. Hans Castorp carries his in his pocket. Some Brady calls it like an ID card, like a driver's license, as it were. Hans Castorp seems to have made it to Madame Chauchat's room, and then he still has a keepsake, no longer the pencil. Broken. But he has her X-ray. This means A, he definitely went to a room, and B, well, one can only imagine the sorts of things. I'll tell you. In the Aeneid, in book 4, when Aeneas and Dido, a beautiful queen, go out on a hunt, a terrible storm comes down on them. Terrible storm. What do you do when a storm is shooting rain down on them? You have to look for cover. Well, these two, this man and this woman, alone, find cover in a cave. What does one suspect happened in this cave? While they are all alone with each other, Aeneas is described as literally looking like golden-haired Apollo before the, think about a hunt and how people are dressed in their finest. The man looks, particularly excellent and epic in his hunting garb, and this is a king man as well. So he ostensibly looks even better. And Dido's great queen, who unfortunately had a husband prior to meeting Aeneas, named Psychias, who was murdered by her own brother in order to take her kingdom from her. When they find themselves in the cave alone, and this situation was conspired both by Venus, goddess of love, and Hera, Juno, in the Roman tradition, goddess of marriage. What does one think happens in a cave between a man and a woman when the goddess of marriage and the goddess of love get together and make this happen? Exactly what one would expect. What happens in a room when drinking is involved between a Madame Chauchat and Hans Castorp? Well, exactly what one would expect. And there's lots of evidence throughout chapters 5, 6, and 7 that what I am suggesting happened did in fact certainly happen. And so, well, we will finish the course and the Magic Mountain and Mrs. Dalloway on Wednesday. I give you back this last minute that I owe you.